basically we're led, ever since we're children, it's a fairly new phenomenon, but since the post-World War II era, we're led to think that there's only one morally legitimate way of choosing the top leaders of our political community, namely one person, one vote. And any alternative to that is somehow morally dubious, labeled bad authoritarian regimes. And it's not just something that it's a childish kind of thing. The research in political science, for example, always uses this label. Democracies and authoritarian regimes. And it's not always very explicit, but it's good democracies versus bad authoritarian regimes. And the question is always, how bad authoritarian regimes can become like good democracies. And it's a real big shock to the moral system, to be honest, to kind of question this view. And but it shouldn't be that hard from a kind of academic or intellectual viewpoint to think of to allow for the possibility that there are morally legitimate alternatives. I mean, just think about it. There's plenty of things wrong with one person, one vote system, and theorists in the past have, in the West as well, have gone through many of those criticisms. Tyranny of the majority. If you have one person, one vote, a majority can exploit a minority. And maybe in Western-style liberal democracies now, that's not such a big problem anymore because there's lots of room for minority rights and constitutional protection of individual interests and so on. But at least this idea that what hasn't been resolved is this view that the majority of voters, and it's a consistent result of social scientific surveys, tend not to have good understanding of the issues that they vote on. Whether it's economics or international relations or environmental issues, what's known now in the literature as voter ignorance is quite striking, and it's not just in the so-called undeveloped countries. Like many in the past, so you say, oh well, China, we're a bunch of mainly lots of farmers or peasants, and they lack culture, they lack education, but once they become cultured and educated, then they'll become like, enlightened Westerners. But it turns out that people in the US, for example, are remarkably ignorant about the most basic economic issues, not to mention how things work in the rest of the world. So the problem of voter ignorance is really a problem in other countries too. And I'm not going to comment about Italy because I know some of you are Italians. But having said that, I did write an article with an Italian graduate student in Singapore. She's doing a joint PhD in Singapore and the UK, and she's told me a lot about Italy. So anyway, I'd love to. And she actually she's writing a whole thesis arguing in favor of a system that would test voters according to their knowledge of different party platforms, and only then would they have the kind of right to vote. I think it's a very good idea, and she's going to develop that into a thesis. Anyway, so there's plenty of things wrong. Now, especially in the US and big countries, now it's called the tyranny of the minority, where it's really a tiny minority of very wealthy capitalists who capture the political process and really use it for their own purposes. So it's only slight exaggeration now that in the US it's not one person, one vote, it's $1, one vote. But I think the biggest problem with one person, one vote, we can call it the tyranny of the voting community, which is that when there's a conflict between the interests of the people who vote and the interests of non-voters who are affected by the policies of the government, like future generations and people living outside the country, then the interests of voters almost inevitably tend to have priority. So on issues like climate change or global warming, where it's really people 30, 40, 50 years from now who are going to be affected, it's very, very hard to constrain the interests of voters in order to protect the interests of future generations. If there's a conflict between, not many voters want to curb their own, consumer energy-intensive lifestyle in order to protect people 50 years from now. And as a result of this one person, one vote system, you tend to have political leaders who, first and foremost, are concerned with protecting the interests of voters. That's even when democracy works well. It's very hard within the political system, especially big countries like the US, to do things that in the interest of future generations or people living outside the country who are affected by the policies of the government, right? Whether it's China or the US, what the government does now affects not just, voters or current generations, but our children, our grandchildren, as well as people living outside the country, right? It's obvious in the case of pollution. Okay, so at least you should allow for the possibility that there are morally legitimate alternatives to one person, one vote as a way of choosing leaders, right? At least we should allow for experimentation. And I think what's happening now in China is that there is this, we can call it an experiment in political meritocracy, but it really has a very long history. And political meritocracy is the idea that the political system should be designed with the aim of selecting and promoting political leaders with superior ability and virtue. And that goes way back in China. You know, it's not just the early Confucians, but many other schools, you know, the legalists and the Moists and so on, in pre kind of imperial China, basically defended variations of political meritocracy. And once, you know, Confucianism became more or less the official, you know, ideology of China in the Han Dynasty about 2,000 years ago, then political meritocracy became institutionalized, you know, not just as a value system, but also more or less in the political system. And how are leaders chosen? By more or less the examination system, right? What's known as the public service examination system. That started in China, started this more or less in a very serious way, was institutionalized about 1,000 years ago. And basically, to become an important, to exercise, thank you, political power in China, of course, theoretically, the emperor had all the power, but in practice, that wasn't the case, right? I mean, no one person could control so many things. And those who exercise political power tended to be selected by means of examinations, and then they were tested in terms of their performance at lower levels of government before being promoted and ultimately giving important posts at the central level of government in Beijing. And more or less, that is a system that has been revived in China in the past 30 years or so. Of course, political meritocracy also has a long history in what we can call Western philosophy, right? Probably the most famous book in Western philosophy, at least in political philosophy, is Plato's The Republic, which really is a case for political meritocracy. I mean, the main point of the book is to suggest that political leaders should go through this very rigorous process of selection and education, training in various disciplines, including training at lower levels of government. And of course, Plato argued that it's philosophers who have the best ability to rule. I disagree with this conclusion, you know, but the basic point that you have to go through this rigorous process of education before you can exercise political power at the highest levels of government, you know, is very similar to what Chinese call, you know, or political meritocracy. By the way, for the Chinese people in the audience or Chinese speakers, we translate political meritocracy as 贤能政治, and there's a whole reason for that I can explain if need be. Okay, so in history, both in China and in the West, political meritocracy has a long history, but more or less, the whole thing ended around the middle of the 20th century. I mean, even in the 19th century, you had great British liberal thinkers like John Stuart Mill, who could argue that, and did argue, that in order to exercise the vote, educated people should have extra votes, you know, because he thought, of course, you have to be a bit more knowledgeable than average when you choose leaders, because the leaders are not just doing things for you, they're doing things for other people. You're not just voting for your own interests, really. And those who are educated are more likely to exercise political power in a wise way, so he argued that if you have more education, you should have extra votes. Now, in the post-World War II era, that view in the West has basically been completely killed, right? If you were to advocate this view now in Canada, you know, people would think you've kind of lost your moral compass, or you've been brainwashed by the Chinese government, or whatever. You know, something happened, and we began to think of one person, one vote as a very sacred political value. In China, the history of political meritocracy was also more or less died out, starting from 1949. Why? Because, of course, the Maoist view was pretty much anti-intellectual, or very much anti-intellectual, you know, and far from, you know, rewarding education in the political process, we should, you know, we should look down on those who have education. Okay, now that has been changed over the past 30 years in China, as mentioned. And really the change didn't first happen in China. It started in Singapore, a tiny little city-state, which you probably know, has about 5 million citizens now. And in the 1960s, they were reluctantly thrown into independence, basically a small island with with very few natural resources and surrounded by potential enemies. And they said, we can't just rely on one person and vote to selected leaders. We have to ensure that our leaders are very, very capable. How do we do that? More or less by institutionalizing a system whereby we're going to select and promote leaders who have high education, and we test them according to psychological tests and various other means, see how they perform, and only then, literally sometimes decades later, can they be promoted and become top-level political leaders. And China was very influenced by this view. When Deng Xiaoping went to Singapore in the late 70s, he became very impressed. And of course, Deng Xiaoping had a little bit of training in the classics as well, and he knew about history and so on. And it made sense to re-implement or re-establish a kind of political meritocracy in China. So starting in the same period as economic reform, in the West, if you read newspapers, the standard trope is that there's been economic reform in China over the past 30 years, but no political reform. Now, why did they come up with that view? And it's because political reform in the West has come to mean select one person, one vote. If there's no one person, one vote to select leaders, political leaders, then it means there's no political reform. But it's such a blind, or let's say dogmatic way of thinking about political reform. There are plenty other ways of engaging in political reform. And that's more or less what happened in China over the past 30 years. Starting from first, it goes back maybe 20 or 30 years, implementation of a rigorous examination system to select future political leaders. And it's not like you go through an exam and you're automatically given power, but more or less it's kind of filtering mechanism where those who have to go through an examination to have a good shot at being a political leader in the future. And once you pass the exams, then you go through lower levels of government, look at performance. If people do well, then they're promoted, and eventually, decades later, they become top political leaders. I mean, that's more or less a theory, but it also has influenced the political reality in China. No system is ideal, and I'm going to talk about that. There's a big gap between the ideal and the practice, like in any other political system, but at least there's been a serious effort to implement political meritocracy in China over the past 30 years. So, in this book, it's basically on political meritocracy, but specifically focusing on the Chinese context. The first, I just provide a brief outline, and then I'll say what I'm going to talk about. The first chapter basically is a critique of one person, one vote, because I think you have to first criticize, at least open the possibility that there are other alternative ways of choosing leaders. At least in Western countries, people tend to be very dogmatic about that. Then the second chapter is how to select leaders in a political meritocracy. What should be the criteria and how to measure those criteria. It's a hugely important issue, but it's been under-researched in contemporary political science and maybe law just because it's thought to be a non-issue in a democracy where you just choose leaders according to one person, one vote. But in a political meritocracy, it's a huge issue, right? Which abilities should be tested? How should they be tested? And so on. And then the third chapter is what's wrong with political meritocracy. Basically, any political system has tons of problems, and we need to recognize not just the advantages, but the disadvantages, and then how do we overcome those. So today in the beginning, I'll talk more about how to select leaders, and then the second half, I'll talk about what are the problems with political meritocracy and how they could be corrected. And then if we have time, I'll spend 15 minutes based on the article that was sent to you, which is, of course, democracy is a good thing. I'm not against democracy. But the question is how to reconcile meritocracy and democracy. And I think there's different models. And I think what I'm going to call the vertical model with meritocracy on the top and democracy on the bottom is more or less the best possible.